I've worked in Grandpa's shop for most of my life. It's been the first job for not just me, but all my siblings and most of my cousins. Grandpa runs a little pawn shop downtown, the kind of place that sells antiques as well as modern stuff, and he does pretty well. I don't think I've ever seen him worry about paying rent, and he can afford to pay us kids better than any other place in the neighborhood. All the other kids quit on it after a while, but I enjoyed the work, and Grandpa always said I had a real knack for it. You keep at it, kid, and someday this old shop will be yours. Grandpa and I live above the shop. He offered me the spare room after Grandma died a few years back, and it's been a pretty good arrangement. Every evening, he turns on the radio and cracks a beer, and we sit around and drink, and he tells stories from back in the day. The radio never seemed to make any noise, and I asked him why he kept it around. He told me it was something he'd had for a long time, and it was special. I asked how the old radio was special, and he said that was a long story if I had time for it. I said I didn't have anything else to do but sit here and listen to the rain, and Grandpa settled in as the old thing clicked and clunked in the background. Grandpa grew up in the early 60s. Technically, he grew up in the 40s and 50s, but in a lot of his stories, it doesn't really seem like his life began until 1962. He describes it as one of the most interesting times of his life, and a lot of it is because of his father, my great-grandpa. He grew up in Chicago, and the town was just starting to get its feet under it after years of war and strife. His mother had died when he was 14, and his father opened a pawn shop with the money he'd gotten from her life insurance policy. They weren't called pawn shops at that point. I think Grandpa said what my great-grandfather had was a brokerage or something. But all that mattered was that people came in and tried to sell him strange and wondrous things sometimes. Great-grandpa had run the place with his family, which consisted of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my great-uncle Terry. Great-great-grandma lived with them, but she didn't help out around the shop much. She had dementia, so she mostly stayed upstairs in her room as she kicked and waited to die. They lived above the shop in a little 3-bedroom flat. It was a little tight, Grandpa said, but they did all right. Grandpa worked at the pawn shop since he needed money to pay for his own apartment, and he said they got some of the strangest things sometimes, especially if his Uncle Terry was behind the counter. Uncle Terry was an odd duck, and that's coming from a family that wasn't strictly normal. Dad would usually buy things that he knew he could sell easily, appliances, tools, cars, furniture, that sort of thing. Uncle Terry, however, would often buy things that were a little less easy to move. He bought a bunch of old movie props, once from a guy who claimed they were genuine props from an old Bela Lugosi film, and Dad lost his shirt on them. Uncle Terry was also the one who bought that jewelry that turned out to be stolen. But that was okay, because they turned it into the police, and the reward was worth way more than they had spent on it. Terry was like a metronome. He'd make the worst choices, and then the best choices, and sometimes they were the same choices all at once. So, of course, Terry had been the one to buy the radio. Dad had been sick for about a week, and it had been bad enough that the family had worried he might not come back from it. People in those times didn't always get over illnesses, and unless you had money to go see a doctor, you either got better or you didn't. He had finally packed it all up and got better, and was ready to return to work. So he comes downstairs to the floor where Terry is sitting there reading some kind of artsy-fartsy magazine, and he looks over and sees that they've taken in a new radio. This big old German model with dark wood cabinet and dials that looked out of a Frankenstein's lab. He thinks that looks pretty good, and he congratulates Terry, telling him everybody wants a good radio, and that'll be real easy to sell. Terry looks up over his magazine and tells him it ain't a radio. Dad asks him just what the hell it is then, and Terry lays down his magazine and gives him the biggest, creepiest grin you've ever seen. It's a spirit radio. Terry announces like that's supposed to mean something. I was working when Dad and Uncle Terry had that conversation, and Dad just pinched the bridge of his nose and shook his head like he was trying not to bash Terry's skull in. After buying a bunch of counterfeit movie posters, the kind that Dad didn't need an expert to tell him were fake, Uncle Terry had been put on a strict $100 a month budget of things he could buy for the shop. Anything over $100 he had to go talk to Dad about, and since Dad hadn't had any visits from Uncle Terry other than to bring him food in the last week, Dad knew that it either had cost less than $100 or Uncle Terry hadn't asked. How much did this thing cost, Terry? Dad asked, clearly expecting to be angry. Terry seemed to hedge a little. It's nothing, Brian. The thing will pay for itself by the end of the month. You'll see I'll show you the thing really is. How much? My dad asked, making it sound like a threat. 500, but Brian, I've already made back 200 of that. Give me another week and I'll. But Dad had heard enough. You spent $500 on this thing? It better be gold-plated, because $500 is a lot of money for a damn radio. Terry tried to explain, but Dad wasn't having any of it. He told Terry to get out of the shop for a while. Otherwise, he was probably going to commit fratricide, and Terry suddenly remembered a friend he had to see and made himself scarce. Then, Dad rounds on me like I'd had something to do with it, and asks how much Terry had really spent on the thing. I told him he had actually spent about $550 on it, and Dad asked why in heaven's name no one had consulted him before spending such an astronomical sum. The truth of the matter was, I was a little spooked by the radio. The guy had brought it in on a rainy afternoon, the dolly covered by an old blanket, and when he wheeled it up to the counter, I had come to see what he had brought. Terry was already there, reading and doing a lot of nothing, and he had perked up when the old guy told him he had something miraculous to show him. I didn't much care for the old guy, myself. He sounded foreign, East or West German, and his glass, I wasn't fooling anyone. He whipped the quilt off the cabinet like a showman doing a trick, and there was the spirit radio, humming placidly before the front desk. Uncle Terry asked him what it was, and the man said he would be happy to demonstrate. He took out a pocket knife and cut his finger, sprinkling the blood into a bowl of crystals on top of it. As the blood fell on the rocks, the dials began to glow, and the thing hummed to life. Uncle Terry had started to tell the man that he didn't have to do that, but as it glowed and crooned, his protests died on his lips. Spirit radio, the man said, who will win tomorrow's baseball game? The Phillies, the box intoned in a deep and unsettling voice, will defeat the Cubs 9-7. Uncle Terry looked ready to buy it on the spot, but when he asked what the man wanted for it, he balked a little at the price. They dickered, going back and forth for nearly a half hour, until they finally settled on $550. I could see Dad getting mad again, so I told him the rest of it too. Terry isn't wrong either. He's been using that Spirit Radio thing to bet on different stuff. The Phillies actually did win their game the next day, 9-7, and he's been making bets and collecting debts ever since. He's paid the store back $200, but I know he's won more than that. Dad still looked mad, but he looked intrigued too. Dad didn't put a lot of stock in weirdness, but he understood money. I saw him look at the Spirit Radio, look at the bowl of crystals on top of it, and when he dug out his old buck knife, I turned away before I could watch him slice himself. He grunted and squeezed a few drops over the bowl, and when the radio purred to life, I turned back to see it glowing. It had an eerie blue glow, the dial softly emitting light through the foggy glass, and it always made me shiver when I watched it. To this day I think those were spirits, ghosts of those who had used it, but who knows? Dad hesitated, maybe sensing what I had sensed too, and when he spoke, his voice quavered for the first time I could remember. Who will win the first race at the dog track tomorrow? He asked. The radio softly hummed and contemplated and finally whispered, Mama's boy will win the first race of the day at Olsen Park track tomorrow. Dad rubbed his face, and I could hear the scrub of stubble on his palm. He thought about it, resting a hand on the box, and went to the register to see what we had made while he was gone. When Uncle Terry came back, Dad handed him an envelope and told him to shut up when he tried to explain himself. You'll be at the Olsen Park track tomorrow for the first race. You will take the money in the envelope, you will bet every cent of it on Mama's boy to win in the first race, and you will bring me all the winnings back. If you lose that money, I will put this thing in the window, I will sell it as a regular radio, and you will never be allowed to purchase anything for the shop again. And if he wins? Terry had asked, but Dad didn't answer. Grandpa took a sip of his beer then, and got a faraway look as he contemplated. That was just how Grandpa told stories. He always looked like he was living in the times when he was talking about, and I suppose in a lot of ways he was. He was going back to the 1960s, the most interesting time of his young life, to a time when he encountered something he couldn't quite explain. So did he win? I asked, invested now, as we sat in the apartment above the shop, drinking beer and watching it rain. Oh yes, Grandpa said he won, and when Uncle Terry came back with the money, I think Dad was as surprised as Terry was. Terry had been using it, but it always felt like he was operating under the idea that it was some kind of monkey's paw situation, and that after a while there would be an accounting for what he had won. When a month went by, however, and there was no downside to using the radio, Terry got a little more comfortable. He started to ask other things, the results of boxing matches, horse races, sporting events, and anything else he could use to make money. It got so bad that his fingers started to look like pin cushions, and he started cutting into his palms and arms. It seemed like more blood equaled better results, and sometimes he could get a play-by-play if he bled more for it. Dad would use it sparingly, still not liking to give it his blood, but Uncle Terry was adamant about it. It was a mania in him, and even though it hurt him, he used a lot. He could always be seen hanging around that radio, talking to it, and feeding it. Dad didn't like the method, but he liked the money it brought in. The shop was doing better than ever, thanks to the cash injection from Spirit Radio, and Dad was buying better things to stock it with. He bought some cars, some luxury electronics, and always at a net gain to the store once they sold. Times were good, everyone was doing well, but that's when Uncle Terry took it too far. He brought the bottle to his mouth, but it didn't quite make it. It seemed to get stuck halfway there, the contents spilling on his undershirt as he watched the rain. He jumped when the cold liquid touched him and righted it, putting it down before laughing at himself. He shook the drops off his shirt and looked back at the rain, running his tongue over his dry lips. One night, we tied on a few too many, and my uncle got this really serious look on his face. He staggered downstairs, despite Dad yelling at him and asking where he was going. We started yelling. We ran downstairs to see what was going on. He was leaning over to the Spirit Radio, the tip of his finger dribbling as he yelled at it. He held out, letting the blood fall onto the crystal dish on top of the radio, and as it came to life, he put his ruddy face very close to the wooden cabinet and blistered out his question. Clearly not for the first time. When will I die? The radio was silent, the lights blinking, but it didn't return an answer. He cut another finger, asking the same question, but it still never returned an answer. Before we could stop him, he had split his palm almost to the wrist, and as the blood dripped onto the stones, he nearly screamed his question at it. When will I die? The Spirit Radio still said nothing, and Dad and I had to restrain him before he could do it again. We don't know what brought this on, we never found out, but Uncle Terry became very interested in death, and more specifically, when he was going to die. I don't know, maybe all this spirit talk got him thinking. Maybe he was afraid that one day his voice was going to come out of that radio. Whatever the case, Dad put a stop to using it. He hid the thing, and he had to keep moving it, because Uncle Terry always found it again. He would hide it for a day or two, but eventually, we would find him, bleeding from his palms, and pressing his face against it. Sometimes, I could hear him whispering to it, like it was talking back to him. I didn't like those times. It was creepy, but Uncle Terry was attached at the hip to this damn radio. It went on for about a month, until Uncle Terry did something unforgivable and got his answer. He watched the rain for a moment longer, his teeth chattering a little, as if he were trying to get the sound out of his head. Grandpa didn't much care for the rain. I had known him to close the shop if it got really bad, and it always seemed to make him extremely uncomfortable. That's why we were sitting up here in the first place, and I believe that Grandpa would have liked to be drinking something a little stronger. Dad and I got a call about something big, something he really wanted. It was an old armoire, an antique from the Civil War era, and the guy selling it, at least according to Dad, was asking way less than it was worth. He wanted me to come along to help move it, and said he didn't feel like Terry would be of any use in this. He's been flaky lately, obsessed with that damn radio, won't even leave the house. To say that Terry had been flaky was an understatement. Uncle Terry had been downright weird. He never left the shop, just kept looking for the radio, and I started to notice a weird smell, sometimes around the house. I suspected that he wasn't bathing, and I never saw him eat or sleep. He just hunted for the radio and fed it his blood when he found it. Dad had already asked him, and Terry said he was busy, so Dad had told him to keep an eye on Mother. Mother, my great-great-grandmother, had been suffering from dementia for years, and Dad and Uncle Terry had decided to keep an eye on her instead of just putting her in a home. Terry had agreed, and as we left the house the rain had started to come down. That's what I'll always remember about that day, the way the rain came down in buckets, like the sky was crying for what was about to happen. We got the armoire onto the trailer. The guy had a thick old quilt that we put over it to stop it from getting wet, and when we got back to the shop we brought it in and left in the back room. Dad was smiling. He knew he had something special here, and was excited to see what he could get for it. We both squished as we went upstairs to get fresh clothes on, joking about the trip until we got to the landing. Dad put out a hand, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed. I could smell it too, though I couldn't identify it at the time. Dad must have recognized it, because he burst into the apartment like a cop looking for dope. Uncle Terry was sitting in the living room, his hands red, and his knees getting redder by the minute. He was rocking back and forth, the spirit radio glowing beside him, as he repeated the same thing again and again. He had found it wherever Dad had hidden it, and had clearly been up to his old tricks again. Dad stood over him as he rocked, his fists tightening like he wanted to hit him, and when he growled at him, I took a step away, sensing the rage that was building there. What have you done? He asked. Today, it's today, today, it's today. Terry kept right on repeating, rocking back and forth, as he sobbed to himself. Dad turned to the bowl on top of spirit radio, and he must have not liked what he saw. I saw it later, after everything that came next, and it was full of blood. The crystals were swimming in it, practically floating in the thick red blood, and Dad seemed to be doing the math. There was more blood than a finger prick or a palm cut, and Dad was clearly getting worried, given that Uncle Terry was still conscious. Where's Mom? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Today, it's today, today, it's today. Where is our mother, Terry? Dad yelled, leaning down to grab him by the collar and pull him up. Uncle Terry had blood on his hands up to the elbows, but instead of dripping off onto the floor, it stayed caked on him in thick, dry patches. The shaking seemed to have brought him out of his haze. It said if I wanted the answer, I had to sacrifice. Terry said, his voice cracking. It said I had to give up something important if I wanted to know something so important, something I loved. The others weren't enough, I didn't even know them, but Mother was, but he stopped stammering when Dad wrapped his hands around his throat. He choked him, shaking him violently as he screamed wordlessly into his dying face, and when he dropped him, Uncle Terry didn't move. Dad, and I just stood there for a second, Dad seeming to remember that I was there at all, and when he caught sight of the softly glowing radio, the subject of my uncle's obsession. He pivoted and lifted his foot to kick the thing. I could tell he meant to destroy it, to not stop kicking until it was splinters on the floor, but something stopped him. Whether it was regret for what he had done, or some otherworldly force, my dad found himself unable to strike the cabinet. Maybe he was afraid of letting the spirits out, I would never know. Instead, he went to call the police, so they could come and collect the bodies. They might also collect him, but we didn't talk about that as we sat in silence until they arrived. Dad told the police that my uncle had admitted to killing their mother, and he had killed him in a blind rage. They went to the back bedroom and confirmed that my grandmother was dead. Dad didn't tell me until he lay dying of cancer years later, but Terry had cut her heart out and offered it to the bull on top of the radio. We assume he did, at least, because we never found any evidence of it in the house or the bull. It was never discovered, and the police believe he had ground up. They also discovered the bodies of 3 homeless men rotting in the back of Terry's closet. He had bled them, something that had stained the wood in that room so badly that we had to replace it. How he had done all of this without anyone noticing, we had no idea. He had to have been luring them in while we were out doing other things, and if it hadn't been for my grandmother's death, being directly linked to him, I truly believe Dad would have been as much of a suspect as Uncle Terry. They took the bodies away, they took the bowl away, though they returned it later, and I ended up moving in with Dad. He got kind of depressed after the whole thing, and it helped to have someone here with him. I've lived here ever since, eventually taking over the business, and you pretty much know the rest. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just listening to the rain come down and the static from the old radio as it crackled amicably. Have you ever used a radio? I asked, a little afraid of the answer. Grandpa shook his head. I saw what it did to Uncle Terry, and to a lesser degree, what it did to Dad. I've run this shop since his death, and I did it without the radio. Then why keep it? I asked, looking at the old thing a little differently now. Because, like Dad, I can't bring myself to destroy it, and I won't sell it to someone else, so it can ruin their life too. When the shop is yours, it'll be your burden, and the choice of what to do will be up to you. I couldn't help but watch the radio, seeing it differently than I had earlier. As we sat drinking, I thought I could hear something under the sound of rain. It sounded like a low, melancholy moan that came sliding from the speakers like a whispered scream. Was my great-uncle's voice in there somewhere? I supposed one day I might find out.